Hello and welcome to Straightforward with me, Scott Craig. With the Syrian conflict now into its second year and a death toll put at 70,000 by the UN, the military situation has become essentially deadlocked. Few observers, though, expected any prospect of meaningful peace negotiations, especially given the opposing views of the US and other Western powers, and Russia, who've been at loggerheads over the future of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. But could that be about to change? The US Secretary of State John Kerry's recent trip to Moscow for talks with Vladimir Putin resulted in what just a short time ago few thought possible: a peace conference on Syria involving all sides, the government as well as those fighting against it. But can a peace conference really change the reality on the ground? What role is Iran playing in the Syrian conflict? What about Israel and Hezbollah or Turkey? And with claims and counterclaims over the use of chemical weapons, what do we actually know at this stage? I'll be discussing those questions and the main question about the prospects for peace in a moment with my guests. But first, this report on that unexpected announcement in Moscow of a peace conference on the future of Syria. It was the moment some thought would never come. Russia and the US sitting down face to face, trying to bridge the gap between their positions on the future of Syria. The US Secretary of State John Kerry and his Russian counterpart addressed the media after hours of talks. And they surprised many by announcing they'd agreed to convene a peace conference on Syria involving both government and opposition forces. The US and Russia have been at loggerheads since the two-year-old conflict in Syria began. Moscow has long suspected the US of trying to topple Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and of arming opposition forces. The US, meanwhile, has condemned Moscow's support of Assad, accusing it of propping him up to protect one of its allies in the region. But John Kerry and Sergei Lavrov played down talk of divisions between them, arguing that peace talks could end the military stalemate in a conflict which the UN estimates has left 70,000 people dead. The proposed conference comes amid disputed claims of chemical weapons being used in the conflict. The US says it believes Assad's forces may have used chemical weapons in two attacks in March, but says there isn't enough proof to say definitively. But that version of events is disputed. Carla Del Ponte, a leading UN investigator, says she believes Syrian opposition fighters, rather than government forces, used the nerve agent sarin, based on the testimony of victims of the conflict. But she also says there is not yet incontrovertible proof. Tensions have also been running high along the Syrian-Israeli border after an Israeli airstrike, which it says was aimed at stopping a weapons shipment to Hezbollah. Syria has rejected the claims and condemned the strike, and 4 UN peacekeepers were abducted near the border by an opposition group, further escalating the already high tensions along the border. It's against that backdrop the peace talks will take place, and they pledged to revive a stalled transition plan known as the Geneva Communiqué, bringing Syria's government and the opposition to the table. But it's unclear if the talks have a realistic chance of succeeding, and what might happen should they fail. Well, to discuss this, I'm joined in the studio by Rosemary Hollis. She's Professor of Middle East Policy Studies and Director of the Olive Tree Scholarship Programme at City University in London. And joining me by Skype is Dr. Rim Turkmani, an astrophysicist and co-founder of Building the Syrian State Current. Welcome to you both. Rosemary Hollis, we've been here before, haven't we? I mean, we were in the question about peace talks. We were here around a year ago. What went wrong then and why now?
Well, picking up on the why now, I think the real breakthrough was a new US Secretary of State, John Kerry, who was able to establish a rapport with the Russians, which was absent a year ago. And because of all the things that have happened since this time last year, I think the American perspective on Syria has shifted from where it was, and so has the Russian. Both of them can anticipate, can foresee that possibly there is something worse that could come in the aftermath of the Assad regime, and they want to review what is the worst that could happen and how can we prevent it.
Reem Turkmani, Same question, really. Why now? Why the sudden urgency to peace talks when we were at this point about a year ago? Why now?
I think most of the external parties to this conflict, the members of the international community, were trying to manage the conflict before, not to resolve it. And they reached a stage where they felt that it is getting out of their control. There is not even one party who can control the situation right now. Not even the regime can control its area. And this spillover effect, the crisis is crossing the borders and destabilizing the whole region. So I think these two important factors added pressure on the superpowers to agree on one solution to end this crisis.
Is there a realistic prospect for peace at the negotiating table in Syria?
I think if they believe in it, it will happen. You cannot reach peace if the parties do not believe in the end goal. But there is no other choice. I mean, war is not a choice. Armed confrontation is not a choice, especially in the middle of what became a civil war and a proxy war. So certainly it has to be talks. But we cannot talk about one solution now to the Syrian crisis. We can put the things on the track towards a solution, but there is no solution that can solve it from A to Z.
Can I add to that we know from other conflicts that peace is not necessarily the top priority for all the players at the same time. And we know from the duration of the Arab-Israeli conflict and the Israeli-Palestinian dimension of it in particular, that for some people there is something more important to them than peace. And to assume that peace is normal, that peace is automatically desirable, is to overlook the fact that once a conflict has got underway, there is the dynamic of revenge at work. People have suffered atrocities, have suffered pain and loss, and they are consumed with the need to avenge that. And equally, there are people calculating that they must make gains before they do a deal. And last but not least, there are, especially in the Syrian case, a lot of people who will have calculated that in the end, they are not going to be safe. That whatever has been happening in the last 2 years will come back to haunt them. That these vengeful motives will operate even post an agreement. And we know that from other conflicts where a deal has been done, but the behind-the-scenes continuation of the tension is not ended.
And does that then override the prospects of actually getting a meaningful or realistic peace?
Well, I think we must know that in the Syrian case, ultimately, what has to happen is that all the protagonists and all their foreign backers have to convene together and thrash out all the issues, and everybody has to come away with something, with a modicum of hope that they will be relatively safe in the future. Forget democracy, forget vindication of any one argument. Saving the people of Syria, saving the situation, will require all those involved in the fighting to be part of the solution. But it may be the case that now is still not the right time for that. And unfortunately, there may very well be more pain and suffering before everybody says enough.
Reem Chakmani, as Rosemary Hollis says there, peace requires the willingness of those who are taking part for peace. What's your reading of the situation? Do you think there is that willingness amongst the various parties involved in this? Do they really want peace?
No, I don't think most of the parties want peace. Certainly the regime didn't show at all a will to reach peace. This is why it's so important for the international packers, as Rosemary said, to convene and to agree on one solution, one plan. And this way, the support they are lending to the different parties on this crisis will not lead to a sum of zero as it is right now. The support will go towards one point. The solution paper right now, every party support a certain local player. However, I would like to say also that yes, the moment right now may not be ideal to reach peace, but tomorrow it's going to be even more difficult because the situation is evolving towards a civil war, and civil war generates mechanisms that helps to prolong it and establish it, and it becomes like a process that, for example, the warlords, the economy of violence and of civil war, all those people who are benefiting from this don't want to end this war, indeed. So we have to look at the resources and try to dry it out, and we have to try now before it gets any worse.
If we're going to look back as well, we have to accept, I think, that the Americans and, for that matter, the British and the French were too quick to pronounce the end of the Assad regime and thereby boxed themselves into a corner whereby they lost face if they included Assad in the future. And yet it's hard to believe that there could be a deal done without the inclusion of the Assad supporters and indeed the man himself. And the Russians are key to that, whether they can get him to see that there is something better than hanging on at the expense of the country and, in a sense, going down with the country.
Should there be preconditions to talks in that case? Because based on what you were saying, it sounds like any negotiation is going to result in at least the possibility that President Assad could survive in some form in power. However, I mean, the Americans have been, if not adamant, have been until this stage very clear that they want Assad to go, as you said. Is there a possibility, though, that that's not going to happen and that peace talks will result in him actually staying in place?
I think you can vindicate the Russians for having pointed out that what the Americans and the Europeans wanted was a Syria that was more satisfactory to them. They wanted to end the dictatorship and bring in some kind of authority which they could call democratic, that would be inclusive of all the sectarian positions in Syria, that would somehow be a beautiful new awakening for the Syrian people. And they got too carried away with saying that that's what it must be. And in the process, you've had more and more Syrian civilians experiencing extreme suffering and displaced, and a massive refugee problem. So if, as the external players put the emphasis on saving lives and saving the refugees from further suffering, they will be less invested in what kind of or who's responsible for toppling Assad, and therefore who takes the gains.
Rim Tugmani, on this question of negotiations, can you have negotiations that don't have any preconditions? In other words, everything is on the table, including the future of Assad, the future shape a government might take in Syria. Can you have talks without preconditions, or are there certain red lines for you that should be there in any peace negotiations?
I don't think there should be preconditions, otherwise the peace talk will never start. However, we need signs of goodwill. There is no point going to negotiations if you know that one of the parties is only there to waste time and spoil the whole thing. One spoiler can spoil the whole process. So we should try to get clear signs from the regime that it is going to show commitments to what's said on the table. So far, the regime failed in doing this. We should focus more on this rather than the precondition. And I agree with Rosemary that the West was too quick in asking the Assad to step down. If anything, actually, this crisis revealed how shallow is their knowledge of Syria and their understanding of the nature of the Syrian regime, because they obviously thought that the scenario in Syria is going to be very similar to Egypt or Tunisia, where in weeks, the regime was gone. The Syrian regime is extremely different, and the personalization of the crisis, I think, is one huge issue that we should not continue to pursue, focusing on the Assad himself. He doesn't even deserve all that attention. The problem is in his power, in his full power. This is what dictatorship is. So if he leaves today, that doesn't mean that dictatorship in Syria have ended. So I think rather than keep saying he should step down, we shouldn't be part of the talks, we should focus on the absolute power that he holds right now, military, security, every type of power. And how can we take this power to put it in the hand of a government, not just because of the Assad himself, of any other president. Even if he stepped down, we should continue to do this to end the regime.
Are you concerned that if President Assad were to leave office or be forced, if the regime were to collapse or be forced from office as part of a peace negotiation, are you concerned that extremist elements could become more influential in Syria and thus derail any future prospect of a peaceful, democratically oriented, if not fully democratic, government?
The more the violence carry on, yes, the more the extremists will, be able to spoil any democratic, prosperous plan for Syria. However, I don't think it's the departure of the Assad himself that is going to lead this. It is how we reach the solution, how we implement things, how do we reach future Syria. If it's going to be through armed confrontation, continuation of war, then certainly we are going to get another dictatorship, and I don't trust that whoever leads this dictatorship that is going to be any better than Assad, whether they're Islamist or even secular. It doesn't matter for me their ideology. What matters is the way they impose this ideology and violate the right of the others.
Rosemary Hollis, on this question of the future, whatever future government we might see in Syria, if we leave aside the question of Assad, if the Assad regime were to fall, our expectations, the West's expectations of what a new government might look like do not seem to match what the reality is on the ground. I mean, this question of extremists becoming more influential, that is a real concern.
Well, the future is implicit in the past 2 years. In other words, the Syrian opposition, those opposed to Assad, cannot be identified as one single bloc with one single ideology, one single sectarian identity, and one neat set of foreign supporters. On the contrary, the opposition is fragmented. The supporters of Assad include, or those who would prefer him to all the alternatives that they can see, include some of the Christian and other sectarian minorities, not least the Alawite one, which is the community that the president himself derives from. Their source of support for the Assad regime is for fear that the opposition is made up in large majority of Sunni Muslims, some of them who are bursting with hatred of Shia Muslims or any non-Sunni Muslims just by virtue of the fact that they don't belong to the same version of Islam. This phenomenon is not the only divide in Syria. It's not entirely about a sectarian divide, but the issue of who comes next is bound up with the expectations that there will be prejudice more manifest in the next administration if it's not avowedly inclusive. And who could preside in Syria and be demonstrably and sustainably inclusive of all the peoples of Syria is very hard to ascertain.
There are several ghosts, possibly, that sort of hang over this whole process as well. The ghost of Iraq, the ghost of Afghanistan, the ghost of the Arab Spring. I mean, does that really color the way that people are now looking at Syria in the terms of, we tried to set up a new government in Afghanistan, tried to set up a new government in Iraq. There were regimes that fell across the Middle East, and what replaced them in Egypt, for example, there were numerous problems with President Morsi's government. Does that color the way that people are now looking at what the future of Syria might look like?
It certainly does, but actually if you look at the current leaderships certainly in London and Washington and Paris, they don't feel any responsibility for what, for want of a better term, went wrong in Afghanistan and Iraq, what turned out differently from what the Bush administration or the Blair government in Britain had hoped for in Iraq or indeed in Afghanistan. So I think the current generation of leaders is actually looking at the Libyan experience and learning from that there are limits to what you can achieve. And the Syrian case is very much more complex militarily. A direct NATO intervention, even provided that the Russians had made this possible through agreement at the UN Security Council, which they did not, a NATO intervention would incur NATO casualties. And the spectre in the background is, because of Iraq and because of Afghanistan, the appetite in America and Europe for more of their own people, their own soldiers, to take not just death, but also very, very devastating injuries. The appetite is not there.
Rim Turkmani, would you like to see, or are you calling for active Western military intervention in Syria?
No, I would not like to see it. I would like to see active political leadership from the West and America in the Middle East. It doesn't have to be bombs or nothing, you know. I'm sure they can lead, they can help steering the process towards a proper democratic transition, rather than just watching and leaving the people of Syria killing themselves, leaving Al-Qaeda to mushroom in the region, which certainly poses a threat to Europe itself.
Rima, how do the outside powers, how do they steer anything in Syria? They're not on the ground, they're not the power brokers inside Damascus, so how does it work? How can they steer all this?
Well, the way they're manipulating the opposition, whether political or military, first of all, politically, they chose certain people to call the opposition, and they chose them to, they recognized them as the one and only legitimate representative of the Syrians, all Syrians, so that means even including Bashar Assad. So that increased the polarization in the whole conflict and led to more confrontation. And of course, it alienated many people, especially the democratic political forces inside Syria, who would never been recognized or even acknowledged their presence by the West. Second of all, the support of the militarized groups, all the arming, which the West have helped indeed, or turned the blind eye on, and never added any pressure on Turkey to control its borders. If the Turkish borders were controlled, we wouldn't have seen Al-Qaeda entering Syria, we wouldn't have seen the conflict turning from political conflict to an armed one. The West and America are also not adding any pressure on Saudi Arabia and Qatar, who are also playing a spoiler role, and they are arming different groups. These groups are even now fighting each other rather than fighting the regime. Certainly Iran, Hezbollah can also be pressured from Russia, but the main point is because of the complexity of this mix of different players, if they don't all agree on one solution, everybody knows that it's not going to work. So they decided to not to settle their differences, whatever they have on their own tables, and leave the conflict in Syria to mature to this extremely devastating level to the Syria and to the region.
That's an important point, isn't it, Rosemary? That in a sense, are we focusing too much on the internal mechanics within Syria and not enough on the regional dimension of this, and of course Iran in particular?
Yeah, there is this parallel that initially the Western players wanted the Syrian opposition, the opposition in exile principally, to mimic what the Libyans had done and make it easier for the Westerners to support them, but that they would do the fighting on the ground and that they would control the fighters on the ground. This is just not happening, and it's beyond their capacity to deliver on that, whether to agree on a platform or to control the fighting on the ground. He who is winning territory, neighborhoods, on the ground, taking the casualties, taking the pain, is a much more powerful player in the mix than he who is in a conference hall in Qatar discussing what ought to happen in Syria. And I think what Reem has just said indicates to me that if all the different players are to give up on their aspirations to prevail over the others or to win comparative advantage, then they all have to get more scared than they are at the moment.
And what would that look like?
Well, we had an inkling of it when the Israelis intervened with a massive, not exactly massive bombardment, but a massive strike on a military installation which they said contained weapons that were to be supplied to Hezbollah in Lebanon, and they didn't want to reach Hezbollah. Incidentally, the leader of Hezbollah subsequently said, if that's what Israel doesn't want, that's what Israel will actually get. We will receive any arms that the Syrians or Iranians or anybody else wish to send us. And we will be in the business of changing the regional calculus by gaining better equipment for the next round of war with Israel. Well, when you have Israel intervening in order to prevent Hezbollah gaining something that they think would be used against them, and Hezbollah responding by saying, that's exactly what we will do, you're talking about the spillover of this into another theatre of war on the border between Israel and Lebanon.
Rim Turkmani, there is a very real prospect that this could escalate from being an essentially internal conflict in Syria, albeit with regional dynamics, into essentially a full-scale regional war, isn't there?
Yes, absolutely. It had this potential from the very first day. I mean, remember, the political borders in Syria are reasonably new. They're about like 90 years old, and they certainly are not clear lines that that separate the sects and the different ethnic groups that live in the Middle East. So any game that starts in Syria will have extension in the region, especially that there is no strong country or countries that control all the borders of Syria. Like if we compare with what happened in Lebanon, for example, during the civil war, it had reasonably similar mixture to the one we had in Syria. However, Syria was, surrounding Lebanon. It was one strong country, so it was able to contain the conflict inside the Lebanese borders. This is not the case with Syria. And the fact that Bashar al-Assad warned against this a year and a half ago, it doesn't mean that we have to ignore it. It doesn't mean that, he was right. Yes, he is a dictator, he's brutal, but he was right. He knew what he was talking about.
Welcome back to Straightforward. This week we're talking about the future of Syria and whether or not peace in Syria could be found at the negotiating table. And I'm joined now in the studio by Dani Maki. He's a Syrian political activist and co-founder of the organization Syrian Youth in Britain. And from Moscow, I'm joined by Dmitry Babic, a political analyst with the Voice of Russia. Dmitry, let me come to you first. We saw the US Secretary of State John Kerry in Moscow for talks with Sergei Lavrov and Vladimir Putin. Is there movement in the US and Russian positions on Syria? Because we saw Lavrov and Kerry were very chummy with each other. They were sort of patting each other on the back. Is there genuinely some movement in the US and Russian positions on Syria?
Well, I think there is not much movement in the Russian position because Russia has been calling for negotiation since the start of the Syrian conflict. But there is certainly a shift in the American position because if you just remember, Hillary Clinton said numerous times that before any kind of negotiation, Assad should go and Russia should be punished for not sharing. Basically, she didn't say exactly that, but she wanted to punish Russia for not sharing the American views on the Syrian problem. There's no talk about this now. So indeed, there is a shift in the American position. But I don't expect peace to establish itself during the next month or two. I think it will take a lot more time. But I'm sure that Syrians will achieve peace if only they are left alone by outside powers. Because I'm sure that the majority of Syrians do not want to destroy their country. They do not want different sects inside the country to destroy each other, and in this way to make a sort of a wasteland out of Syria.
Danny Maki, what would you actually like to see happen in Syria? Here we are 2 years later. The UN estimates about 70,000 people have died. There have been allegations of war crimes on both sides of the conflict. What would you actually like to see?
Well, there is common consensus at this current moment in time, and I would also like to see this: a comprehensive, broad political solution which brings all of the warring parties in Syria onto a negotiating table with the UN as an observer and Russia and America as superpower patrons observing this potential peace settlement, with the United States obviously should be playing a role of an objective observer, not one which is politicized. And this is ultimately signified by the shift in the US position, essentially besieging Russia to act as an arbitrator in the Syria crisis. I would like to see a cessation of all violence, a ceasefire which stops all of the actual fights on the ground between both sides, and essentially a political process which is Syrian-led to ensure a democratic transition in Syria, with Assad remaining in power until elections, because forcibly removing Assad now, and the West have identified this, would essentially open the door for more conflict, more violence, and a sectarian war which would be twice as brutal as it is now. So what we ultimately want to see as Syrians is an end to the military crisis before we can start an end to the political crisis. Negotiations and dialogue is the pretext for creating a Syria where the conflict is finished through a consensus which is agreed and observed by regional Arab and non-Arab countries.
Dimitri Babic, before you joined the program, we were talking about the wider regional implications of this, particularly with Iran. Israel has taken part in a strike recently, aiming, in its words, to stop weapons reaching Hezbollah, something in Syria denied. But there must be concerns also in Russia about the wider regional implications of this, and specifically the possibility of a wider regional war taking place.
Well, that's true, but I think that Russia does not bear the same responsibility for the consequences that may follow. Russia does not bear the same responsibility as the United States or Great Britain. After all, it was not Russia who attacked Iraq and who, in this way, among other things, made the Iranian influence in the region so much greater. And it was not Russia who mistakenly took the so-called peaceful demonstrations in Syria for the burden of some excellent democratization process. I think we can see right now that what is unfolding under our very eyes, it's a tragic situation. If the rebels indeed win in Syria, if they establish a radical Sunni state in Syria, certainly it will have bad implications for Iraq. This is not something that I say, this is something that the Iraqi Prime Minister, Nouri al-Maliki, has been saying during the last few weeks. So we have basically Western powers, maybe unwillingly, maybe with the best of intentions, we have them destabilizing the countries of the region, one after another, with the goal of destroying the regime in Iran, which they say they don't like, but which they themselves helped to establish in 1979, when a lot of Western powers were deluded about the nature of the Iranian Revolution. So, indeed, I think that Russia is concerned, but Russia is primarily concerned by the Western position on this issue.
Russia is concerned about the Western position on Syria, but certainly Russia is also trying to protect its own interests in Syria also. I mean, Russia's support for Assad, it has been argued, is also more about Russia's own strategic interests in the region also.
Well, I'm not sure, because I talked to military specialists. The Russian so-called base in Tarsus has not been in operation for a long time. There are just several people actually working there. And I don't think anyone expects Russia to wage any wars in that area fighting against Israel or protecting Syria. This is not Ukraine, this is not Georgia. Russia has become a regional power since then. So I don't really believe that Russia provides a lot of support to Assad. And second, I don't believe that Russia is doing it for egotistic interests. In fact, I think that Russia is doing it out of principle. Because when you see how a sovereign nation, a member of the United Nations, how that sovereign nation is being attacked by a number of countries which have no understanding of what's going on in Syria. I mean, take all of these friends of Syria. There are hundreds of countries, and most of them have no idea what Syria is like. And they all interfere. They all say that we should send troops to Syria, or we should pay salaries to the Syrian rebels. I quote now Hillary Clinton again. She promised salaries to those Syrian soldiers who would defect from the army. So I think Russia is dismayed by this kind of attitude to a sovereign state. That's the real concern of Russia.
Dmitry, from your perspective and your reading of the situation, would the Russian government accept a future Syria that did not include Assad?
Well, I think no one will ask Russia, because obviously the fate of Syria is not decided in Russia. Russia does not provide too much support to Syria. If it provides any support, I think it's minimal, because there is no way Russian planes can reach Syria unless they go through the Turkish territory or through the Iraqi territory, and there are lots of ways to control these movements. So I think that no one will ask Russia, but certainly Russia is not under any illusion that the rebel government, if it comes to power, is going to be in any way friendly towards Russia. In fact, Islamist fundamentalists in Syria have been very anti-Russian since Syria became pro-Soviet, because it's a very simple equation. For the Muslim fundamentalists, America and Russia and Europe are parts of the same decadent Western civilization. So in Israel, which was a client of the United States, Muslim fundamentalists were anti-American. In Syria, they have always been anti-Russian and anti-Soviet. But I'm not sure if these people come to power that they're going to be pro-Western. I think they're going to be pro what they are now. They're going to be pro-jihad. And they're going to be anti-Western and anti-Russian.
Dani Maki, that's a real concern, isn't it? That when we're looking at the future of Syria, and you outlined before what you were calling for, which is a transition to a time in which elections can be held. But that's a very difficult prospect, isn't it, to try to hold democratic elections in a post-conflict country which has very difficult dynamics going on, sectarian dynamics and so on. That's a very difficult prospect, isn't it?
Of course, this obviously invokes the concept of conflict resolution. However, the biggest problem in Syria is the level of extremism, which is inherent now internally inside the country. What was established recently was a joint Islamic state between Iraq and Syria, essentially outlining the fact that fundamentalism in the Iraqi sense through Al-Qaeda has essentially been transferred to Syria. Both the Sunni jihadist groups between Iraq and Syria are working in tandem with each other. This obviously sets out numerous implications for the region, for regional stability, and the actual territorial sovereignty and integrity of Iraq and Syria. The bigger problem is the issue of fundamentalists, how Syria is essentially now witnessing the tourism of jihad, how the majority of young Arab extremified youths are essentially coming to Syria for jihad. There are numerous Western figures who have come to Syria for the concept of jihad. A recent report in King's University stated up to 800 Western jihadists who were born in the West have come to Syria for jihad. French, British and Belgium internal security forces have been observing the presence of fundamental Islamists who have been coming to Syria. So essentially this is a concept which does threaten the West. It has a very big base in the West, especially the fact that Syrian rebels are influenced by radical clerics who are based in Western countries. The concept that radicalization is very new to Syria's diverse ethnic socio-political mix, which has always been, in essence, a moderate ideology of having moderate Islam, anti-Salafism, anti-Wahhabism, anti-extremism in the religious sense. Syria is a state which is known for its level of Islamic moderation, how it values the concepts of history and tradition without having a firebrand notion of religion. Now, what this essentially does now is create an ideological war inside of Syria, which is being portrayed on a regional level as well. What you essentially have is the Syrian government, which is by all means was not moderate over the last 40 years, but now has come to be a symbol of moderation, a symbol of secularism, one which is not known in the region. What we essentially have the Syrian rebels, and especially the Islamic militias, essentially symbols of extremism, of fundamental radical Islam, which is being pursued ideologically by certain states in the Gulf, such as Saudi Arabia, such as Qatar. So in Syria, there is not just a geostrategic regional struggle, there is also an ideological struggle, this vacuum of pan-Arabism, which is now being filled with Islamic fundamentalism. Now, the major concept here is that Islamic fundamentalism in the Syrian notion has no real borders. Essentially, after the Syrian conflict finishes, if the rebels are successful in seeking the policy of regime change, which, let me state, is actually funded and aimed and aided by Western countries. I mean, America in Syria now is allied indirectly and inadvertently with these Islamic movements, much different to how Russia is. The Islamic militias now in Syria are anti-Russian, but are pro-American. The Washington Post recently stated how the biggest amount of humanitarian and logistical assistance to the Syrian rebels comes from America, over $400 million so far. So it's hardly conceivable to argue that a country which will provide this sheer volume of monetary and fiscal finance for these rebels would be staunchly anti-rebel. The biggest problem is the instability, which becomes infectious when you have radical fundamentalism. It comes to Iraq, Lebanon. We also know the south of Turkey, which has a very delicate sectarian structure, will also not be safe from internal destabilization.
Do you think the situation could have been very different if Assad had pursued meaningful reform, democratic reforms, as opposition figures had been calling for right at the very beginning? Do you think that this situation, the outcome could have been very different?
Or we could argue to an extent that certain decisions could have been made in a better way. They could have been structured to suit the actual situation more, to actually calm the predicament rather than fueling the flames. But we could argue, on the other hand, that why would a Chechnyan or an Afghan blacklisted terrorist come to Syria to support the reform process? They clearly have an agenda in Syria, which is of creating an Islamic state. The West have a different agenda. Now, this is the big conflict here between the regional Arab states who seek an extremist government in Syria to pursue and perpetuate their geopolitical interests on an ideological and political scale, whilst weakening the influence of Iran in the Middle East and their resolve, whereas the Western countries seek removal of Assad at any cost, because Assad has always been one of those pan-Arab leaders which has had an element of resistance to Western hegemony and never been a real friend of the West. In fact, Assad has been an enemy of the West, especially in regards to many numerous Arab causes, from Palestine to Lebanon to Iraq, where Assad openly was against the Western intervention. So this, in terms of what the West, did not endear them to Assad. Now the West seek a policy which is, perhaps Assad remaining in power would be of beneficial nature to the West, because a radical Islamist militia, if it would come into power, would mire Syria in Islamic extremism, which would, in essence, inevitably transfer to Western countries and European countries, as well as pose a significant threat to the regional stability of the Arab world, which is something which, especially the Western countries, now see as a very delicate issue, especially after the destabilization of Lebanon and directly Iraq through the Syria crisis.
Dimitri, what, in your view, is the danger if these talks fail? People will just go back to their original positions, and we're in a situation which could really spiral into a wider regional conflict. Is that really the danger if the talks fail?
Well, the danger if the talks fail is that the status quo will continue. I think the status quo is terrible. I mean, these horrible images of a rebel commander actually carving out the heart of a dead Syrian soldier. I mean, these images speak for themselves.
There have been allegations of war crimes and atrocities committed by both sides, including the incident with he's a man identified as Abu Sakar by Human Rights Watch. Are we in a position to know exactly what's going on the ground? Because particularly with the allegations about chemical weapons, there were allegations that Assad's forces used chemical weapons. There were, however, not allegations, but Colle Del Ponte, the UN investigator, came out and said that she believed that opposition forces, rebel forces, had actually used chemical weapons. It's a very confusing picture on the ground, isn't it?
Well, I read a number of newspapers on the situation in Syria, and I noticed a very interesting trend. When you want information blaming Assad for everything that happened, when you want information documenting the crimes of the regime, you can obtain it for free. But if you want in-depth analysis, if you want interviews with the jihadist fighters who come to Syria, if you want Colle Del Ponte's real statements on the use of chemical weapons by the rebels, then you need to subscribe to some sort of paid services. You have to make an effort. So since the Soviet times, my impression was that if a certain information is sort of forced on you, most probably this is propaganda. The real truth, you have to make an effort to get to it. And it seems to me that the real truth is that the Syrian government, bad as it is still many times better than the jihadist opposition fighters, especially those of them connected to Al-Qaeda. I would also draw your attention to the fact that the fighter who was filmed actually carving out the heart of a soldier, that fighter is not a member of an Al-Qaeda affiliated group. He is a member of the brigade which is affiliated with the so-called Free Syrian Army, the same Free Syrian Army which the West wholeheartedly supports even now.
Danny Maki, on this question of allegations of atrocities, there are numerous allegations of atrocities committed by pro-regime forces and allegations concerning opposition forces, as we've just been discussing. It would appear that both sides are guilty of essentially committing war crimes.
We could argue that there have been atrocities committed and perpetrated by both sides. However, it's hard to equate a state with militias. This is the problem, the essence of accountability. How do you account for the opposition militias? Who do you go to? Each group has their own tribal leader. Each group is essentially fractured and fragmented. There is no real command structure. The so-called command structure, which is essentially a facade, is based in Turkey, which does not really have accountability on the ground. They state they control the militias, but clearly, as we see from recent footage, they don't. The other concept is the fighter, which you just discussed. He's the founding member of the main unit which created the Free Syrian Army. So he is essentially one of the fundamental figures who created the biggest rebel movement which the West have deemed as moderate and liberal and worthy to arm. And recently, in a very kind of ironic sense, they have committed the worst atrocity committed by rebel forces thus far. What this essentially shows is that they are not moderate forces, they are not liberal forces. The difference between the Free Syrian Army and the Al-Qaeda militants is just the terminology which is given to them by Western countries. The actual ideology is the same, the mechanism in which they pursue their means, the level of coercion they perpetrate among civilian populations is the exact same. The Free Syrian Army were essentially a mirage to cast away or kind of conceal the presence of the Islamic groups from the very first day. There are no democratic opposition forces in Syria. There are no rebel movements who have in essence an idealism of liberalism. The majority of them are extremists. The majority of them have significant financial flows from Qatar and Saudi Arabia, which impose against them and force them in tandem to become more extremist. The more extremist you are, the bigger your flow of income. So this would essentially be an incentive for rebel fighters to become more extremist in this sense. The issue with the propaganda. I ultimately believe that recently there has been a significant change in the narrative of the mainstream Western media. We have seen, especially after this atrocity which was committed, which was given mass coverage in the mainstream, that there is lots of questions and critique as to the real wisdom of funding and supporting these rebel movements, of how these essential individuals who are guilty of committing these atrocities are meant to be financed by Western countries. Cameron, on the very same day that this horrific video was shown, stated that he wants to double the non-lethal aid for the Syrian armed rebels. So that this is essentially not glorifying but rewarding terrorism, rewarding brutality, and essentially stating to the world that we will conceal rebel aggression and rebel massacres from the mainstream media, and we will support them through non-lethal aid. Whereas Human Rights Watch states this is possibly the worst atrocity committed in the Syria war thus far. So the real sheer gravity of these acts which are committed and should be condemned and deemed as reprehensible internationally are really acts which are reprehensible for all Syrians, but which Western countries should really seek to condemn, as opposed to only condemning one side.
But all of that, be that as it may, the Assad government and military pro-government forces stand accused of numerous atrocities committed in the city of Homs and elsewhere in the conflict. And my question is, given all of that background, given the brutality that we have seen take place in this war, is it then possible to sit around a table and negotiate?
Conspicuously, every single conflict finishes with a resolution, a settlement. There is no concept that a conflict in the history of the human race has finished without there being a settlement, a comprehensive settlement which finishes. We had the Vienna Convention, ended the Napoleonic Wars. We had the Treaty of Versailles, ended the First World War. We had even after that, the Second World War. What we have is history littered with empirical evidence of conflicts finishing in a settlement. The Lebanese Civil War ended by the Taif Agreement. So what we do understand is that Syria needs a political settlement, despite the conflict being perpetrated in terms of massacres from both sides. Both sides understand that they cannot continue in this current form. There has to be a political solution, a settlement and a mechanism to take Syria to a new phase where there is peace, stability and tranquility. Massacres, which if they are identified not through Western sources but through independent, 100% verifiable sources, that these massacres have occurred, there has to be a council or an observer group from inside Syria which has the full backing of all of the superpowers, all of the bigger states, the UN and the Arab League, to really identify who are the actual figures implicated in these massacres. And if it is shown that these massacres were really authentic and original and did occur, then the individuals who committed them must be taken to court, a Syrian court, not a UN politicized court or an international politicized court, but a Syrian court, so the Syrian people can essentially judge who was correct and who was incorrect. This is the way it should be done.
Why not follow the model of other post-conflict societies, such as the Balkans, being a very classic example, and set up an international tribunal to investigate these issues? Because the issue is those who are directly involved in the conflict are not able to take the dispassionate and objective view that you describe.
This is the problem that we have. Essentially an issue of trust. In conflicts, trust is always broken. How can either side of the Syrian warring conflicting sides actually trust the West? Or trust the kind of the pro-Syrian government states? Clearly the Syrian government and all of the Syrian government supporters would never put their trust in America or the Western states, who they deem have been funding and aiding very clear terrorism for a period of 2 years. They lack this integrity, especially the Western states, in terms of the Arab world, with their colonial history and their Orientalist perspective on events, to really take a step forward and to initiate these tribunals. Moreover, the opposition forces would not be able to trust the so-called BRICS countries. So what we have is an issue of trust. What we need is a completely objective international force made up of equal countries, both those who have been pro-government and those who have been anti-government, to really take a tribunal and establish whether massacres were committed on government or non-government sides, and essentially take the individuals who were implicated and put them on trial for the Syrian people to judge, who was right and who was wrong. On the issue of chemical weapons, Carla Del Ponte stated that there was concrete accusations and speculation, concrete, that rebel forces did use chemical weapons. Now,
she did say that it was. She didn't say.
She said concrete. Not
she said that it wasn't incontrovertible.
She also said concrete speculations, which to an extent does indicate that there would have been something concrete to an extent.
She said what she said was based on the testimony of victims.
Now,
that she believed that that rebel forces had used possibly sarin gas.
Because there was a very big media frenzy on the issue of chemical weapons. The regime was instantly blamed, to which it transpired after a few weeks that it wasn't the regime who have used them. States such as Britain and France and the US claim they have evidence of Syrian regime using these weapons, but one would possibly argue if they really had this evidence, it would be in the mainstream by now, seeing as they would use it, definitely, especially to pressure the Assad regime at this current moment in time. The other concept is the Syrian government did establish that there was weapons used on Khan al-Assad. Also, the rebels have a history of using chemical weapons. If you remember, there were these videos which went significantly viral on rebels using chemical weapons on rabbits and stating that they would want to use these weapons against ethnic minorities. So that would essentially be a prerequisite to using these weapons.
That's not proof that they in fact did so. I mean, it's quite difficult to obtain. I mean, this is actually the point, though, that it's quite difficult to
condemned by Western countries,
objective information,
which so far would be enough to suggest that rebels would have a motive in using these chemical weapons.
We're very nearly out of time, but Dimitri Babic, just one last question. 1 year from now, looking into your crystal ball, where are we going to be?
Well, I don't think that in a year we'll have a 100% peace in Syria. I'm certainly not sure about that. But hopefully, my hope is that the government and the rebels, the Syrian rebels, not the foreign rebels, will sit down to a table and there will be a tentative ceasefire. This ceasefire will obviously be broken by foreign fighters, the ones coming from Iraq, the ones coming from other countries. But if Syrians themselves agree, they will be able to protect themselves from these provocateurs. That's the optimistic scenario, if you want. There's also a pessimistic scenario, unfortunately much more likely, and that is that the fighting will continue and we'll be sitting and having the same kind of discussions in a year.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for on this edition of Straightforward with me, Scott Craig. But my thanks to my guests, Danny Maki, Rosemary Hollis, Rim Tokmani, and Dimitri Babic in Moscow. Don't forget, you can find out more about Levant TV on our website, levant.tv. And also, Straightforward has a Facebook page, and we would like to hear your comments and feedback on today's show. But for now, from me and the rest of the team, thanks and goodbye. Used in the conflict. The US says it believes Assad's forces may have used chemical weapons in 2 attacks in March, but says there isn't enough proof to say definitively. But that version of events is disputed. Carla Del Ponte, a leading UN investigator, says she believes Syrian opposition fighters, rather than government forces, used the nerve agent sarin, based on the testimony of victims of the conflict. But she also says there is not yet incontrovertible proof. Tensions have also been running high along the Syrian-Israeli border after an Israeli airstrike, which it says was aimed at stopping a weapons shipment to Hezbollah. Syria has rejected the claims and condemned the strike, and 4 UN peacekeepers were abducted near the border by an opposition group, further escalating the already high tensions along the border. It's against that backdrop the peace talks will take place, and they pledged to revive a stalled transition plan known as the Geneva Communiqué, bringing Syria's government and the opposition to the table. But it's unclear if the talks have a realistic chance of succeeding, and what might happen should they fail. Well, to discuss this, I'm joined in the studio by Rosemary Hollis. She's Professor of Middle East Policy Studies and Director of the Olive Tree Scholarship Programme at City University in London. And joining me by Skype is Dr. Rim Turkmani, an astrophysicist and co-founder of Building the Syrian State Current. Welcome to you both. Rosemary Hollis, we've been here before, haven't we? I mean, we were in the question about peace talks. We were here around a year ago. What went wrong then and why now?
Well, picking up on the why now, I think the real breakthrough was a new US Secretary of State, John Kerry, who was able to establish a rapport with the Russians, which was absent a year ago. And because of all the things that have happened since this time last year, I think the American perspective on Syria has shifted from where it was, and so has the Russian. Both of them can anticipate, can foresee that possibly there is something worse that could come in the aftermath of the Assad regime, and they want to review what is the worst that could happen.
Hello and welcome to Straightforward with me, Scott Craig. With the Syrian conflict now into its second year and a death toll put at 70,000 by the UN, the military situation has become essentially deadlocked. Few observers, though, expected any prospect of meaningful peace negotiations, especially given the opposing views of the US and other Western powers, and Russia, who've been at loggerheads over the future of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. But could that be about to change? The US Secretary of State John Kerry's recent trip to Moscow for talks with Vladimir Putin resulted in what just a short time ago few thought possible, a peace conference on Syria involving all sides, the government as well as those fighting against it. But can a peace conference really change the reality on the ground? What role is Iran playing in the Syrian conflict? What about Israel and Hezbollah or Turkey? And with claims and counterclaims over the use of chemical weapons, what do we actually know at this stage?
I'll be to happen, and how can we prevent it?
Rim Turkmani, same question really. Why now? Why the sudden urgency to peace talks when we were at this point about a year ago? Why now?
I think most of the external parties to this conflict, the members of the international community, were trying to manage the conflict before, not to resolve it. And they reached a stage where they felt that it is getting out of their control. There is not even one party who can control the situation right now. Not even the regime can control its area. And the spillover effect, the crisis is crossing the borders and destabilizing the whole region. So I think these two important factors added pressure on the superpowers to agree on one solution to end this crisis.
Is there a realistic prospect for peace at the negotiating table in Syria?
I think if they believe in it, it will happen. You cannot reach peace if the parties do not believe in the end goal. But there is no other...
Discussing those questions and the main question about the prospects for peace in a moment with my guests. But first, this report on that unexpected announcement in Moscow of a peace conference on the future of Syria. It was the moment some thought would never come. Russia and the US sitting down face to face, trying to bridge the gap between their positions on the future of Syria. The US Secretary of State John Kerry and his Russian counterpart addressed the media after hours of talks. And they surprised many by announcing they'd agreed to convene a peace conference on Syria involving both government and opposition forces. The US and Russia have been at loggerheads since the two-year-old conflict in Syria began. Moscow has long suspected the US of trying to topple Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and of arming opposition forces. The US, meanwhile, has condemned Moscow's support of Assad, accusing it of propping him up to protect one of its allies in the region. But John Kerry and Sergei Lavrov played down talk of divisions between them, arguing that peace talks could end the military stalemate in a conflict which the UN estimates has left 70,000 people dead. The proposed conference comes amid disputed claims of chemical weapons being used